We already know what happens when there's not space for everyone, when there's not a seat at the table, a level playing field, or even a playing field at all. But at Rutgers School of Engineering, we've got space. Space that is all yours. Space to build. To build big ideas. That builds confidence. To build character. That builds momentum. To build bonds that build careers. But most importantly, to build a future that makes space for all of us. Rutgers, the future must be built.
Well, I can attest to that. Although I don't remember the drone lab or the motorcycle, certainly not the race car, I would have remembered that. Although I'm told that the race car was around, and it was just that the MEs were hiding it from us. So, but it's great to see that Rutgers continues to invest in giving our students the very best. Hey everyone, I'm Rami Elghandour, ENG'01, and it is an honor to be here and speak with this distinguished group of admitted women. I'm also told that we're joined by current students, some Rutgers alumni, and some of our friends outside of Rutgers as well, so welcome everyone. This being Women's History Month, I'm here to speak with you about diversity. And I'm often asked why I'm such a passionate advocate for diversity, and specifically gender equity, and a supporter of the social justice movement as well. And like all of us, we're all a product of our upbringing, and specifically our upbringing, our educational background, and our professional experiences. And for me, it starts with being fortunate to be born to just an incredibly strong woman. My mom was immigrated to the States when she was around the age of 18 and started businesses across 2 continents and really set me up with an incredible foundation as a person. I was also really influenced by Superman. We're going to talk about superheroes a little bit today, but I was always fascinated from a young age with this character that had all the power in the world and used that power for good. And equally importantly, the humility with which he handled that power, which was really left an imprint on me from a young age. Educationally, Rutgers gave me just an incredible platform for success. Again, as an immigrant kid who frankly grew up without much and never got to travel, coming to Rutgers and making friends from Nigeria to Greece and Turkey to Mexico quite literally opened up my world. And we didn't have this term growing up, but I certainly, this term of imposter syndrome, but I certainly felt the weight of expectations at certain points in my life, as I'm sure many of you have. And Rutgers really gave me the hard skills, the education, to give me the confidence to launch what turned out to be an incredibly successful career. And professionally, I'm new to this pursuit of curing cancer. I just started at Arcellx about a little over a month ago, although that was following several months of diligence, so I'm a little bit up to speed. But in my prior company, I built that company from about 30 people to nearly 1,000 people. And knowing that our people would determine our culture and drive our performance, I decided early on to interview every single person we hired. And that turned out to be a lot of interviews, but it was really great because I got to know every single person in the company. I knew everyone by name, and that really contributed to the positive culture I was hoping to establish. Now, I can tell you a lot of interesting stories out of those interviews. The one that's always stuck with me is I was interviewing this person for a finance role, and she was really experienced. When it was her opportunity to ask questions, a little more questions to learn more about the company, she looked at me and she said, I've never met a CEO before, and I've worked for a lot of companies, big and small. So can I ask you, what do you do? What's your job? And she said it just like that, so it always stuck with me. And to this date, I now get this question quite frequently. I gave her this answer on the spot, and I've always used it since, that my job as a CEO is to make sure we're hiring the best people, we're creating an environment where everyone could do what they do best every day, that I hold everyone to an equal and accountable standard, meaning there are no favorite people or favorite teams, and that I set the long-term strategy and vision for the organization. And with that approach, we built a company where over 50% of our managers were women, over 40% of our team members in technical roles like R&D were women, and I can tell you that our diversity absolutely powered both our culture and our success. Now, unfortunately, the world more broadly isn't very equitable. As I said earlier, I truly believe we're each a product of the world that we're born into, and there just exist two completely and distinctly different worlds for men and women, and for boys and girls, academically and professionally. And today we're going to talk a little bit about what are some of the underlying challenges that create this inequity, and some of the solutions that we can engage in individually and collectively along the way. And at the end of this talk, we'll open it up for some Q&A to get into some of this discussion. So to start this conversation, I want to share with you a quote. And again, you're going to notice a superhero theme here throughout. Bonus points if you can identify who this superhero is. Fighting supervillains is a cinch. Fighting misogyny is the real challenge. That's the reality for most women. Doing the job is the easy part. It's dealing with the obstacles and the biases outside of that job. That's the real challenge. Imagine graduating from college, which many of you can very easily imagine, as it is going to be coming up soon here in the next couple of years. Imagine graduating from college and landing your dream job at the top company in your field. But when you show up for your first assignment, you're told you can't actually sit with your team. You have to sit in the secretary pool or in a windowless closet because women weren't allowed to sit on that particular floor. That's a true story from a friend of mine. That same friend had to change in the parking lot in the winter before every day of work because the parking lot where she had to park was quite far from the building, and believe it or not, women weren't allowed to walk into that building with pants on. So she used to have to wear her pants under her skirt and take them off in the parking lot before she went in, because they weren't even allowed to walk into the lobby and change in the bathroom lobby. Now, I know this sounds insane and arcane, and it must be from like the 40s or 50s or something. Believe it or not, this is from the mid to late 80s, and I know that probably still feels like a long time ago because maybe you're not as big of fans of 80s movies as I am. So let's take a look at what the world looks like today. Pretty powerful, huh? I mean, I'm struck by these images every time I see them. You know, I've given this talk a bunch of times, and it always has the same effect. And obviously, the inequity is quite stark, and it really hits you. But the other thing that always hits me is just how global this issue is. We're not talking about an issue that impacts a small group of people in some corner of the world. We're talking about something that impacts half of the world's population. So what are the underlying challenges that create this inequity? Well, there are a number of them, but the three that I want to focus on today are the gatekeeper effect, unconscious bias, and pseudoscience. And so let's talk about all three of these, starting with the gatekeeper effect. This is Britt Marling. She's an actress, a writer, and a director, and she wrote a really powerful piece in The Atlantic about her first encounter with Harvey Weinstein. Like a lot of young actresses, she thought, wow, this is my big break. I'm meeting with Harvey Weinstein. She was supposed to meet him at a hotel bar, but when she arrived, she was met and told that he was too busy to come downstairs. She needed to go up and meet him in his suite. Reluctantly, she made her way up there and quickly found herself in a really difficult and compromising situation. What she actually writes about is her ability to get up and leave that situation, and specifically, she says, while it was the actress that walked into that meeting, it was the writer who was able to get up and leave. Because in her own mind, she knew she can control her own destiny. She knew because she was a writer and a creator that even if Harvey Weinstein never put her in a movie, she can create her own opportunities and chart her own path. And that's the challenge with these gatekeepers. They don't just trap you creatively, they trap you economically. And in these instances, they rob women of their agency, they rob them of their ability to consent, and they rob them of the opportunity to provide for themselves and for their future. So what can we learn from these stories? Well, first, we have to hold leaders accountable, and we have to hold them to a higher standard. We also have to really understand consent in the context of power, make sure that we're educating around that, and make sure that we're holding people accountable based on that understanding. And that is a really important topic that probably needs its own separate detailed talk. We also have to understand that this current environment and the lack of gender equity, particularly in positions of leadership, creates room for this sort of abuse of power to happen. And it's a great reminder of why we particularly need gender equity in positions of leadership, something I'm going to talk about again later and is very core to what we want to take away from today. Sadly, before I move on, this experience, this conversation, one wasn't new with Brit Marling and certainly continues to go on. Now, obviously, there are stories out of New York around something along the lines of this topic that are happening right now. So how do we get into positions of leadership? Well, one way is through entrepreneurship, and that's certainly the path I took. So let's take a look at how venture capitalists evaluate male and female entrepreneurs in this 2-year study of a Swedish venture capital fund. So if you were young and male and you presented to this group, you were considered young and promising. If you were young and female, you were considered young and inexperienced. Now, I can tell you that hiring managers generally do not want to hire inexperienced people or people who don't know what they're doing, so that is not a good take. Let's go to the other end of the spectrum. Let's say you'd already raised money. I have a background in venture capital. I can tell you that's a huge positive because it's a big part of the job. If you were male and you'd raised money, you were considered a very competent innovator and you had money to play with. If you were female and you raised money, you were good looking and careless with money. Wow. I mean, this is literally the definition of bias, right? You have two groups with nearly identical attributes that are being perceived and treated very differently, purely based on their gender. And that bias has a real economic impact. In this study, women received only 25% of the funding amount that they requested, whereas the men received 52%. And in a separate study of Silicon Valley companies, one of the greatest, if not arguably the greatest place in the world for wealth creation, women were found to account for about a third of the workforce in these startups that were surveyed, but only held 9% of the equity in those companies, meaning that the men held 91%. Right? So if you thought the 2x multiple of 52 to 25 was bad, this is a 10x multiple, and in an arguably in an area where it matters even more. How else do we get into positions of leadership? Well, we get hired, we get promoted, we work our way up, and so let's take a look at how unconscious bias impacts the hiring process. If you have a slate of candidates for a role and only one of them is female, she statistically has a 0% chance of getting that job. The same goes for minorities. As risk. So if you have one woman in that candidate pool, even if she's the best person for the job, when the interviewers go back and debrief, they might go, you know, she was the best person, but she's also the riskiest candidate. So what hiring managers want to do, they want to mitigate or eliminate risk in the hiring process, so they'll pick the next best person because they feel a little bit safer. The second you introduce a second woman into that, or a second minority into that hiring pool or candidate pool, the gender no longer stands out, it no longer gets translated as a risk, and we're actually able to focus on choosing the best person based on their merits. And that's what this is really about. It's not about hiring more women or more minorities. It's about overcoming our biases, particularly unconscious biases, that prevent us from hiring a woman or a minority when they're the best person for the job, right? It's also really important to apply this same concept to promotions and selecting people for teams or projects. McKinsey has great research that shows that, if you will, the broken rung in that ladder of success for women is that first promotion to manager. So if we're making sure, again, that we're evaluating diverse slates of people when we're making promotion decisions, we're making selections for teams and projects that give people those experiences that lead to promotions, we can really take a huge step forward in addressing gender inequity. This is why I personally, when I have searches, and I have a couple of searches right now ongoing with particularly with executive recruiters, I tell them that I will not close that role until I've seen a diverse slate of candidates. And I will push them and challenge them. Sometimes they'll push back and say, well, we can't really find enough people or women in this particular category. I will do my own search, and I will let them know, hey, I found like 10 women or 15 women within 10 miles of the office, so you can at least certainly reach out to those. So I think pushing people and challenging people when they push back on this too is really, really important. This sort of unconscious bias is why we have more CEOs named David than we have female CEOs. And David isn't even the most popular name for a male CEO. That's John. I know you were going to guess Rami, but it's not Rami. This sort of unconscious bias is also why when people were asked to name female tech leaders in a separate survey, they didn't name Marissa Mayer or Sheryl Sandberg. They actually named, are you ready for it? Alexa, and of course, Siri. Nothing against Alexa or Siri. I'm sure in some Matrix-like way they're going to be ruling the world someday, or Westworld-like way. But well, you know, there are other people we can think about at the moment. So we got a lot of work to do. One other really important point I want to talk about, and hopefully one of the key takeaways for you today before we transition from unconscious bias, is this concept. There are some people who will argue that, you know, I'll concede men and women are equal, but, you know, it's not women's ability, it's really their behavior that's holding them back. And I have sadly and frustratingly gotten into arguments with other CEOs who hold this perspective. Fortunately for us, these researchers who published in Harvard Business Review looked at exactly that. They looked at an organization where 35 to 40% of the entry-level workforce was female, but only 20% of the top 2 layers of leadership was female. And these folks were really comprehensive. I mean, they looked at who attended which meetings, who talked to who, they looked at who participated in the informal networks of the organization, they looked at electronic communication, you name it. And you know what they found? They found virtually no difference in behavior between men and women in this organization. So it wasn't ability, and it certainly wasn't behavior that was holding women back. It was bias, simply bias. Now let's transition from the world of unconscious bias to conscious bias, or pseudoscience. This is the spread of misinformation to influence this topic on gender equity and diversity. Now, I'm going to take a step back here for a moment. I put this talk a couple of years ago. This idea of misinformation has just exploded, right? From COVID and misinformation about the pandemic and vaccines to election fraud. I mean, this sort of topic of pseudoscience and misinformation is now sort of impacting the very fabric of society. So that in and of itself also requires kind of a longer conversation. But back to gender equity, if you haven't heard of it, because it's also from a couple of years ago, there was something circulating called the Google memo. Now, this doesn't have anything to do directly with Google. It was written by an engineer at Google who's no longer there. And he essentially argued that women shouldn't be in technical or leadership roles because of underlying differences in biology. Now, I can tell you from my personal and professional experience that is categorically untrue. You can also tell me the same from your experiences, but we're engineers and scientists, so let's go to the evidence. This idea has been debunked in literally thousands of studies that have looked at soft skills like leadership, more recently, and harder skills like math and science. Outside of like something like the Olympics or certain professional sports, there is no underlying difference in biology that would limit a girl or a woman's ability to do anything, period. Even when it comes to sports, you know, I played sports throughout my life, up to and including over the last couple of years. And I can tell you that I have a lot of female friends that are much better. It's really only that you see this difference in biology at things like the Olympics, when you're comparing kind of the elite of the elite across both sexes, that you see kind of a difference in speed and power and so on. But in terms of kind of general population, that's not even something we should be generally thinking about. Unfortunately, this combination of pseudoscience and unconscious bias has a real impact. Let's start by looking at elementary school children, which I have a couple of myself. When teachers know students' names, boys do better in math. You can probably guess where this is going. When the grading is anonymous, the girls do better. Now, how is that possible? Particularly for us as engineers, like math is math. I really, really struggle with this one. Let's grow up and go to where you are, college. If you remind students of their gender immediately prior to a math exam, the girls do dramatically worse. But if you call it a problem-solving test, the gender gap disappears. This is really important because it tells us that our efforts at addressing gender inequity cannot just be focused on one group. Like, we can't just focus on educating men. We have to actually focus on educating everyone. This is an issue. These unconscious biases, these obstacles, this pseudoscience really impacts everyone. So our efforts have to be holistic. We have to really target everybody. Now, I want to get to what is kind of the central point of today's conversation, why diversity makes us smarter and better. When we're around people who are different from us, we tend to prepare more, we tend to anticipate alternative points of view, and we tend to realize that it's going to take more effort to reach consensus, so we put in more effort. As a result of those factors, organizations with women on their boards tend to outperform across nearly every financial metric, and papers written by diverse authors, and in the case of this particular study, it was ethnic diversity, tend to outperform from both an impact factor and a citation perspective. When we're on people who are similar to us, we tend to kind of think that they know what we know, so we don't share as much. But when we're on people who are different from us, we tend to share more, and as a result, learn more and grow more. And that's why we individually benefit from diversity. And I cannot help but believe, particularly given my leadership experience, that if we had the full talent and imagination of 50% of the world's population unencumbered by these biases and these systemic obstacles, we would live in a dramatically better world. I mean, think back again, imagine if those entrepreneurs, those female entrepreneurs got the same level of funding as their male counterparts. What would that mean for the world, right? More advancement, more jobs, better products. We would live in a dramatically better world. It's not hard. It's not that hard to imagine. Now, I want to talk about two really important things to put all this into context. Context is really important. The first one being inclusion. I really love this particular quote. Diversity is being invited to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance, right? Diversity alone isn't enough. If you look at that spice shaker, it is clearly diverse. But if I picked it up and I shook it, only the salt on the top is going to come out. So diversity alone is simply not enough. We have to aim for inclusion. What does inclusion mean? Inclusion means that we have representation. It means that everybody in an organization, a team, a society has the opportunity to fulfill their full potential, and that the leadership of those teams and societies and organizations are representative of the people within those organizations. So that's what inclusion means, and it's critically important for us to truly achieve gender equity, because just having ratios or people is not enough. And when I look at Rutgers, I was really proud to see that on an undergraduate basis, we are, I think, about 30% or more, 32, 33% higher in terms of female undergraduate enrollment in engineering. But what made me even more proud is to see that over 50% of executive board positions were actually held by women. That is kind of, if you think about it, the difference between equity and inclusion, and we need both. I also want to talk to you about specifically, if you kind of picked up on the nuance, I talk about gender equity and not equality, although people talk about equality all the time. And that
language is very powerful and very important, and this is a really critical point. Equality is great if you're dealing with a level playing field, but when you're talking about the obstacles and the biases that we're talking about today, and that you all know certainly better than I, we need more than equality. We need equity. We need to give people what they need to overcome these biases and these obstacles, and we need to remove or extract the obstacles in their way. And again, similar to the conversation about misinformation, this conversation is certainly expanding when you think about this past year and the Black Lives Matter movement, the social justice, George Floyd. I want to kind of step back and talk about a parallel concept that's also very important in the context of gender equity and super important in the context of social justice, which is privilege, right? The best definition I've heard about privilege is not the presence of an advantage, it is the absence of an impediment. So when we talk about white privilege, for example, we're not talking about that our friends and our family members or white, that they have some distinct biological or other advantage over us or our friends or colleagues who are diverse. We're talking about that our minorities, our diverse members of our society are facing systemic biases, systemic oppression, systemic racism, systemic gender inequity. And so to sort of address privilege, you actually have to remove those obstacles. You have to give people what they need to overcome those obstacles. So when we talk about equity, when we talk about privilege, we're talking about sort of the dismantling of these systemic issues. Some of them are mental and unconscious bias and require training, and some of them are structural, like, when we talk about social justice, prison reform, and things like that, and social justice reform. So those are really important topics, and again, and have much longer conversations about them. So how do we do this? Well, it starts with education. Education has been and continues to be the most powerful tool in the world for affecting change. And that's why I put together this talk, and that's why I encourage all of you to go and follow the links in this talk. This is, you can find the talk on the TED website and YouTube and so on, and actually try to read the underlying articles and research and use them as a launch point to have conversations and educate yourself. But we also, it's kind of like the law of conservation of energy. We have to convert that energy into advocacy. We live in an incredible moment in time where everyone truly has a voice and everyone can make their voice heard with social media and so on. So, and other forms. So put together your own talks. Share this talk as a point to create conversation with your friends and your family, and try as much as you can to go out and advocate for this topic. And I'm a big superhero person, so I'm going to reference a line from my other favorite superhero besides Superman is Spider-Man. With great power comes great responsibility. There has to be a call to action to people in positions of leadership. And it is what it is today. A lot of those people are men, but there are women in positions of influence as well. If you're in a position of leadership, you have to do more. You have the opportunity to have an outsized impact on this particular topic. And you don't have to be a CEO. You could be a recruiter, an investor, a board member, a manager. If you're in any sort of position of influence, you can have an outsized impact on this really important conversation. And I encourage you to take those steps forward. And lastly, I want to leave you with a professional story a personal story, before I open it up for questions. So I think at this point, the cat is out of the bag. I am a big superhero person. You probably see Wonder Woman and Superman and Captain Marvel behind me also. So like a lot of parents, I wanted to get my kids into the things I love. And in my case, it's superheroes, right? And I was able to successfully get one of my boys into superheroes via Lego Batman a couple of years ago, but I couldn't really get my first daughter into it. And so I looked and I came up with this. This is DC Superhero Girls, and it is awesome. And it's not just awesome for girls and kids. It is awesome for adults. It's super fun. I highly recommend it. When I found this and I put it on, my daughter actually sat and watched all the way through it and wound up getting books and so on this topic. And the next time her cousins and her friends came over, they didn't play princesses. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I've made a lot of snow for Frozen birthday parties over the years. And we're huge Disney fans down to my Mickey Mouse watch. But they actually put capes on and flew around the house and played superheroes. And it was just one of those subtle but really important reminders that sometimes you don't believe you can get into that position in life until you see someone like you in that position. it's sort of a reinforcement of what we're talking about with inclusion and why representation matters. And I've certainly had moments in my life where I felt like that, and they encouraged me to kind of take a leap and take a step forward. So I know that collectively we can make that kind of world happen and be true for all of us. And so in the words of DC superhero girls, get your capes on, let's take flight. You could be anything, you could do you could do what you like. And I know that future is going to be a reality for my daughters, for all of you, and for girls and women around the world. So thank you for joining us today again. And with that, I will open it up for your questions. So let's take a look here. We have, give me a second here to read the questions that the Senyan team have put into our chat. So the first question comes from Suraj. Suraj says, love the inclusion in superheroes. What was your path from Rutgers to Wharton to venture fundraising like? My sister got her MBA and is trying to carve a path for herself. We'd love your perspective. So first of all, Suraj, thank you for the question. Before I forget, I'm happy to chat with your sister. So you can find me on Twitter or LinkedIn or whatever. Just shoot me a message and we'll set up some time to chat with her. My path was actually pretty interesting in the sense that it took a lot of help for me to get to where I am. Out of Rutgers, I worked as an engineer, and I really loved being an engineer. And what kind of changed my life as a mentor, I became really good friends with our CFO. For no other reason, honestly, that life is quite serendipitous because we were in a work fantasy football league together, and that was sort of our first reason for chatting. And he kind of took me under his wing and gave me the perspective I didn't have as kind of an immigrant kid who wasn't around a lot of success growing up, and explained to me why it was important to go to business school and why it was important to go to certain business schools for for the type of career you wanted to pursue. And so that was kind of the first step. The second step was when I got to Wharton. It was just incredible to be around a lot of people with a lot of different perspectives and prior roles. And so I learned about venture, and something I'd literally never heard of before I went to Wharton. And, there was elements of it that I thought were really attractive. And that, there it was sort of, I don't want to take up too much time on this, but we can follow up in more depth. Like I said, an internship kind of wound up turning into a full-time role. But again, I will say one really important thing that I've really been fortunate to have great mentors in my career. That first mentor when I was an engineer, Jim Caruso, my mentor and boss when I was in venture, Brad Vail. Like, I've had people who believed in me and gave me a lot of opportunity. My first manager, Greg Martin. I've had a lot of people who have really gave me opportunity, and anyone who's successful who tells you they got there on their own is kind of full of it. You definitely need help along the way, and I'm happy if I can to be that help for you and your sister, Suraj. Ellen comes to us with the next question. What is the composition of the interviewing team? That is a great question. So you definitely want to have as much diversity in all sorts of forms and ways on your interviewing panels. So I look at it as you certainly want gender diversity, you want to try to have ethnic diversity, but you also want like cross-functional diversity. I like to make sure that cross-functional teams interview as well as people at different levels in the organization. And you can sort of, if you sort of matrix all of that out, I think you get a better chance of finding the right people. I also find that I don't think of interviews as singularly directional. I think a lot of companies and people do. I think of them as a little bit more like a relationship, like you're going to date or marry this person. And so it's a cooperative kind of decision. And so in a way, the more intensive and broad and more exposure that the interviewing panel gives the candidate, the more they can also sort of select if this is the right company for them. And if you're getting the benefit of them, having a lot of information to make the decision and you having a lot of information to make the decision, I think it increases the probability of that marriage being a success. The next question comes from, hopefully I'm saying this right, Vani. How can we begin to motivate recruiters and employers to diversify their candidate pools? I think it's a great question. There are people who are coming at this from a couple of different angles. I think you see that in the state of California, for example, there's a mandate that boards have diversity on them, particularly in terms of gender diversity. I think those laws can be helpful. I think at the very least in terms of stating the importance of the topic. But I'm also very much more of a bottoms up sort of person. So I think a lot of it comes down to education. I think a lot of it is leading by example. So one of the things that we tried to do in my last company, we'll certainly do it in this company as well, is to talk about this and to release our gender statistics and sort of in almost like a societal perspective, put more pressure on or make it the norm that we're having this conversation. We're talking about these statistics because if people have to talk about it publicly, they're going to have to do better, right? So I think that's one thing. I think, again, the onus is on people in positions of leadership to take a stand to make sure that we are setting the bar high, that we're challenging recruiters and so on in order to have an outsized impact. And I think a big part of it too, again, goes back to education. I mean, I truly think that pursuing diversity and particularly gender equity is a competitive advantage, right? Like if I'm trying to build a company and someone else is trying to build a company and I have access, let's say that the candidate pool for a position is 100 people, 50 men and 50 women. And this other company, because of unconscious bias or purposeful bias or whatever, is excluding half of the candidate pool, right? So they're only looking at 50 people. I'm looking at 100 people. Who has the better odds of getting the best person for the job, right? Like we do. And I'll take a little bit of a tangent here too. When I talk about culture, I always use this like Michael Jordan analogy. Steve Jobs used to have this quote where he'd say, most people think the dynamic range or difference between the best person and the average person is 3-1 or 5-1. But in my experience, it's more like 50 to 100-1. So I'd rather have a small group of A+ players and they'll run circles around a larger group of B and C players. And I generally, obviously, very much respect and agree with Steve Jobs with one exception, right? And I call that the Michael Jordan exception. If you had Michael Jordan on your team, how many average players would you trade Michael Jordan for? Is it 3 or 5 or 50 or 100 or 1,000 or 1,000,000? Not that you can have 1,000,000 people on a basketball team. It's not measurable, right? The difference between the best person and the average person is not measurable. So if you put hiring in that context, then it's really that, to me, it's that important to get the absolute best person. I cannot afford, if I'm going to be successful, to pathos and ethos, but some people are going to be persuaded with data. Some people are going to be persuaded by, sort of the justice argument. This is just the right thing to do. And some people are going to be persuaded by credibility. So we need more and more credible people speaking up. Next question. In your professional travels, do you come across many other male leaders who understand and promote gender equity? Yes. This question was from Eileen. Yes. Not, I think it's increasing, not as many as probably you and I would like, Eileen, but certainly I think there are people who get it, and I think people more and more are starting to get it. Next question, would you comment on, this question is from Natalie, would you comment on how diversity impacts creativity and teamwork? I think there is no question, particularly in positions where there is creativity involved. The more perspectives you have and differing perspectives, the more that's going to lead to a better result. If you look at, creative agencies and so on and how they work, a lot of times that is sort of core in terms of at least create diversity of discipline, but I think diversity in ethnicities and gender and so on, and certainly contribute to that. And I've certainly experienced that myself. I think the more diverse teams outperform, and you've seen in my talk that the metrics kind of prove that out. And the teamwork, I think I kind of covered, right? Like when we talk about why diversity makes individuals and teams and organizations better, it's because we actually innately behave differently when we're around diverse people and are in diverse teams. So I think that there's a lot of great research on that, and it's been my professional experience as well. The last question we have here is from Jessica. How do you deal with or stand up to other male leaders who are biased and closed-minded? The answer to that, Jessica, is going to be, it depends on the context. So I'll give you 2 examples of how I've handled them. And you know, a lot of it depends, and those are not the only two ways to handle them. It could be that you need to call someone in to help you, or you need to strategize with other people on how to change that person's mind. But let me start with a general comment. You know, there's a lot of research right now, particularly in some of the larger topics we talked about, like social justice and misinformation and so on, about how difficult it is to change someone's mind. And the short answer is, it depends on what that person's motivations are. People, you know, aren't monolithic and aren't uniform. And so it's kind of going back to my logos, pathos, and ethos. You kind of have to understand what motivates that person and what kind of argument may be best to help them kind of see the light. But the two examples I can kind of share with you is, at one point in my career, I had a boss where I wanted to hire someone for a particularly important role. And the person I wanted to hire was female, and she had about a 2-year-old and in her early 30s. And my boss basically said, "Are you sure you want to hire her, given that, you know, she may have another kid," and so on. Now, it's a totally inappropriate thing to say, and frankly, an illegal thing to say. But my response to that particular person was like, "Look, this person reports to me. It's my responsibility. So you can hold me accountable for the decision. I've interviewed a lot of people. She's the best person for the job. And I'm going to move forward with her." And so deflecting sort of the accountability to me as the hiring manager was the way I chose to hold that. And guess what? She did join. She did an awesome job. She had a kid. Everything worked out fine. But I think sort of, taking accountability is one way to sort of handle it. The other example is, I alluded to it earlier. I've gotten into more than once, but one in particular, I remember a debate with a CEO who was essentially telling me, he doesn't hire as many women. This is a CEO in the healthcare field of like a hospital system, because, you know, he believes he has some data set that supports that decision in terms of productivity. And I said, great, show me the data, because my experience certainly doesn't support that. And, you know, when you sort of get into the data, you can call out their biases and where they're kind of misinterpreting it or so on. So I think kind of challenging people, if you have the ability to challenge them, or pointing out, you know, where they're mistaken, and trying to alter their perception, is certainly one way. But there's a lot of different ways, and it really comes down to where that person's biases emanate, and kind of. A transformative experience for me. There's no way I'd be sitting where I am today if it wasn't for that, both personally and professionally. I hope it is equally amazing for you, and I think we'll appreciate your attention and your questions and your engagement today. And again, you can, if you want to, reference anything in the talk, you can find it on YouTube or TED. And I encourage you to try to go and read more. And you can certainly find me if I can ever be helpful to you in your career. Don't hesitate to reach out. So I will turn it back over to the RU crew to transition us from here.